Eelco Hooftman is a landscape architect and founding partner with his partner Bridget Baines of Grossmax Landscape Architects based over the last 2 decades in Edinburgh, Scotland, the still United Kingdom, I guess. Eelco is Dutch by birth. He studied at the infamous School of Landscape Architecture at Wageningen, and he's taught and served as a design critic at a range of leading design schools in Europe, including the Edinburgh College of Art, the Architectural Association in London, the Academie van Bouwkunst in Amsterdam, and the ETH Zurich. He's, for the past 5 years, been a visiting professor at the Graduate School of Design here at Harvard. Grossmax's recent projects include Royal Festival Hall, Potter's Fields Park, and a very interesting landscape master plan for the Royal Botanical Gardens at Kew. More recently, he's been working on a very, very large, important, interesting central park for a new central business district in Beijing, as well as the transformation of Tempelhof Airport in Berlin into a major new park. I think that Eelco and Bridget are among the most interesting and significant landscape architects of their generation practicing today on the international scene. They have won an astonishing array of awards and honors and recognition, including a number of Royal Society of the Arts Art for Architecture Awards. They were also a recipient of the 2006 European Landscape Architecture Award for their design work. They've recently been awarded the UK Public Realm Architect of the Year Award in 2010, and in 2011, the Sterling Prize. Please welcome Eelco Hooftman.
It's really, really nice to see that the Boston Garden Mafia has taken over the Isabella Gardner Museum, and rightly so. I just, to prepare for this talk, I just made my leisurely stroll to the museum, and I really started to realize that the museum is designed as a garden. I'm not talking about a garden museum, museum garden, but really truly the garden, the way how it's orchestrated around the courtyard, the rooms, which is all about different times and geographies. It's this kind of layering and remodeling fragments of culture into one new composite. It's a fantastic garden experience. And talking in what I think is probably the most beautiful museum in the world, there's only one museum which comes close, is the Soane Museum in London, but it is truly one of the most fantastic experiences you can encounter in terms of museums. And so tonight I have to talk about visuality, I have to talk about paintings and the relationship about paintings and maybe the work of Grossmax. I put those two together, and I don't know about Renzo Piano, but for sure he must have taken a kind of reference of the space we're in today and the courtyard itself as a way. And of course the courtyard is a fantastic, I mean, to be honest, this building from the outside is next to nothing. It's like an austere box. And the way how the museum is turned inside out and built around the garden, this is of course a complete fiction. You know, you don't find this in Venice. This is Venice turned inside out. But no doubt, I think this perfect cube, but this is a perfect cube we're in today. The height and the width and the length are all the same. For sure, it's quite Platonic, but inspired by the courtyard itself. Yes, we have to talk about architecture. Now, Renzo Piano is excluded from this because he's, of course, a good architect and he's a craftsman and he's an artist. But most architects, my God, do we know them with their towering egos? And then, my profession, being a landscape architect, is altogether quite different. It's more down to earth, more philosophical, more thinking about space and time as a process of slow transformation. It's not Isabella Gardner, but that's how I imagined her in her prime. It's this idea that you could be seduced by landscape. You know, landscape, you should sniff landscape. You should take a big breath of fresh air. And I hope to explain some of that tonight. The idea of landscape as ecstasy. I like this map of Europe. Sorry to take you to Europe, but the idea is that the whole of Europe has become one big urban constellation. And this is important because when I was educated myself in this illustrious Wageningen, as being introduced by Charles, all my education was about rural land use, the countryside, etc. But of course, my own interest as a kind of young rebel punk was in cities and the culture of cities. And most of our work is indeed, it all takes place in cities. Cities are the field of our operation. I think, and I'm quite unscrupulous about making the statement that landscape is all about visuality. It's about the idea of framing the landscape. It's about, here we have two pictures of films. One is the Draftsman Contract, Peter Greenaway, and Antonioni, the film Blown Up. The Blown Up is about the idea of, in this case, a crime has been committed in a suburban park in London. And the photographer tries to find on this shot he's taken the evidence of this crime. But I like this idea. On one hand, we are very scientific. We have to zoom in, zoom out to do our discoveries. And the other hand, we are very painterly and very about optical devices, about framing the landscape. This is my hometown in the Netherlands, the city of Haarlem. The painting is, of course, by Ruysdael, 17th century painting. I like this painting. Look at the pregnant sky, the sheer straight horizon, and even the foreground is already the combination of nature, but also the countryside as an industrial project. The bleaching of the linen on this field was, in those days, an industrial activity. And of course, the other thing is, of course, the church is punctuating the horizon. And my God, in Holland, you have to be religious because you are 6 meters below sea level. So either you believe or you have to be a true optimist. What I will do, I take you into that the big center church in the picture, and take you to the next painting. Is Sarendam, the famous interior church painting. And I like this. This is all about architecture. Architecture is about volume, it's about space, it's about light. I also like the asymmetric perspective, the idea of the movable furniture, the dog, the child is quite humanistic in all those aspects. The next painting is by Birkenheide. And this is looking towards the church, standing next to the town hall overlooking the market square. So here we have it all together. We have a religion, the church, we're having the market, the economy, and we're having the town hall, we're having politics. So this is all about civic space. And I put those together because I think this kind of range exactly sums up what the profession of landscape architecture is and should all be about. It's going from the large scale to the architecture, from the strategy down to the detailed design. And I quite like to break down the word landscape architecture. In the word land, it's about scape, giving form, and it is about architecture in its own right. Another painting. We'll still know where it is. We're a bit careful in Holland about our paintings. Vermeer. But what I really found interesting about this painting, in many paintings of Vermeer, you see the map of the Netherlands in the background, and it's like a secret code. It's like the land is a kind of object. It's a kind of commodity. It's something to be proud of, and it's a project. And some very simple Photoshop shows you the more latest is very simple, my profession. The latest map of the Netherlands. And if you see how the Dutch have been beavering away, this is all swamp and wetlands, and all that land has been drained and became the cultivated Dutch productive landscape. And of course, look to the city of Amsterdam, which the city itself is actually more organic, the way how it grows in those rings like a tree, and the landscape itself it's much more geometric and man-made. So it's a kind of strange reverse psychology in the Dutch landscape. And this is then the result, the landscape, a total work of art, which every square meter is being planned, discussed, debated, and man-made, built. And probably only lasts for 20 years, and then you have to start again to keep the land productive for its next cycle. So a complete total work of art. Now, of course, that kind of idea about landscape gives a kind of strange idea of Dutch conceptual art as a kind of escape from this straitjacket. And it needs a German. You know, we all know Germans, there are good ones and bad ones. This is a good one, Joseph Beuys. A fantastic artist. And he really told a very good story about the Dutch landscape. Basically, he said about the Dutch landscape that we Dutch really completely bucket up our own landscape, big time. And his theory is very simple but very intriguing. He said, you Dutch have reclaimed so much land out of the sea that you lost your liquid mirror. You lost the beautiful reflecting light bouncing back on this kind of shallow waters. And since you have taken all that water away and made it into land, you lost the liquid mirror, and you Dutch have not produced any artwork of any visual quality any longer. Quite intriguing, and a good reason for me to live in Scotland in exile. This is another interesting Dutch early sketch about the refracting of light, 17th century sketch. So the Dutch always have been obsessed by light and landscape. This was the landscape I was responsible for in the Netherlands when I was working in the Netherlands, the Dutch polder landscape. And yes, it is intriguing, it's man-made, it's functional, it's modernistic, but it also is a straitjacket. So I really felt I had to escape. I was interested in the sublime, the idea that landscape could become something more like art and more part of an aesthetic discourse. So I started to live in the United Kingdom. And this was one of our very early manifestos. The good days when I started the office in 1996 is that we didn't have any work. It's fantastic, you know. There's nothing as good as a good economic recession to create, you know, new ideas and new approaches. So I hope that this recession will last to create a new generation after us. But we wanted to project ourselves in the context of the British landscape. We call it the art of the artifact, the cult of the cultivar. The idea that landscape is an aesthetic experiment and is a kind of philosophical and political discourse. And we believed that in the last century, landscape became translated with the word environment, and that what used to be a very delicate green tissue became this monstrous green blanket. You know, quality was being replaced by quantity. I like the idea about how landscape, poetry, and designed landscape interact. It's fascinating to see that my heroes like Voisin and Claude Lorrain, they actually were inspired by the poets, the Greek and the Roman poets about the Akkadian landscape, and that so the written landscape became the drawn landscape, and then the drawn landscape became the fabricated landscape, the designed landscape. And if you take this part of London, for which we did a landscape strategy for this the Akkadian landscape around the River Thames, the kind of the designed landscape then subsequently became inspiration for the painted landscape, and it is Turner. So I like very much this bouncing back and forwards like ping pong between the painting as an ideal landscape and then the constructed landscape as an inspiration for painting. Another one of my more recent heroes is Edgar Allan Poe, who I seriously think that the best essay ever written on landscape and the idea of the relationship between art and landscape is the small short story Domain of Arnhem. It's a fantastic, full of theoretical knowledge. The story is actually two parts. The first part is a theoretical discourse, and the second part is a more a field trip to this idealized landscapes. But it's a fantastic poetic way what Poe understood that landscape is much more than just a representation of nature. It's a much more fundamental metaphysical way of approach and how we position ourselves in the world. Now, this is not my image. I only wished I had made this. This is actually one of my students in the Harvard in the landscape school. The painting, this drawing is only 2 hours old. I just literally ripped it from the student. Evelyn Voss, and projected here. This project I do is called the Endless Landscape. And Endless Landscape was a series of cards. It's a card game of 24 cards. And you can move the cards around to create an endless landscape. And my idea in my own practice is to make 24 cards and then don't do any more work, just to reshuffle the cards for all my clients. So one pack of cards will do. But this student is on a real winner. Look, this is fantastic idea of the combination of the foreground, the mad circus, and the strange Hudson School of Painting landscape in the background. Two of my heroes, Bacchus and Apollo. Bacchus is, of course, all about hedonism. It's about the heat of the moment. It's about party time. It's about ecstasy. It's about chaos. And on the other hand, Apollo, which is all about rigor, order, structure, architecture. What I found interesting, instead of talking about extremes of opposites, I think that landscape is one of those very few professions who could reconcile those opposites. I think in a good landscape, you see both elements represented in one piece. So this reconciliation between Apollo and Bacchus, I think, is a very fundamental character of landscape. Another one of our early statements when we didn't have any work. It really, if I think about it, these were the days. You know, we could just fart around and do whatever. This statement was about that landscape is all about layers. It's a palimpsest of time, and actually the key task of a landscape architect is to reveal those layers, nearly like an urban striptease. And to be a good landscape architect, on one hand you have to be seductive, like Miss Marple. Like Mata Hari. Not Miss Marple. Miss Marple is all about being shrewd and being clever and putting the dots on the right place. So two of my heroes, Mata Hari and somebody who I would like to cast as Miss Marple. And look at the hat. I'm sure that Isabella Gardner would be very pleased about that hat. Another aspect of landscape. Landscape is always this idea about longing to this kind of long-lost paradise, paradise lost. It's always trying to find at least an approximation of the ideal landscape of which we are maybe expelled from. I like this picture very much in the way I put them together, because on the right, it's Germany. It's the Englische Garten, which is also funny. The Englische Garten in Munich, which is Munich is a heartland of conservative Germany, and give them a piece of nature, and all hell breaks loose. I like that. And of course, the other idea about landscape is, of course, this that death is also take place in Arcadia, and it's also about violence to a certain extent. It's about decay. Two pictures of my friend, the photographer Thomas Truss. I put them together in juxtaposition. Actually, the painting on the left is called from a series called Paradise. So on one hand, you could say this is the field of operation of landscape architecture, hardcore nature to hardcore city and everything what is in between. Again, I don't see those as extreme opposites. I see them as very much similar. I think we can look to the city as a jungle, literally an urban jungle. You can look to those high-rise and still see different age groups from the early 19th century to the end of the 20th century, buildings growing towards light. I often literally borrow language from ecology and superimpose them on urbanism. For example, if you've got a piece of wasteland and the first vegetation colonizing the wasteland, you call pioneer vegetation. And over time, this vegetation is getting more complex, both in spatial composition and species distribution, until you ultimately get climax vegetation. I think we can talk the same about cities. This idea of pioneer urbanization evolving all the way to climax urbanization. I talked about Holland before in terms of the light and the typical light condition creating the ideal of the Dutch paintings. But I think there's something even more fundamental. I think the landscape you've grown up in, it really defines the culture you come from. And in the Dutch landscape, it's mud. Literally, that's all what it is. We don't have bedrock. It's mud. It just flows. We got the tide of the sea bouncing, eating away land. We got the rivers, and the rivers, all the leftovers from Germany, makes Holland. It's a delta landscape. And I'm sure that gives, the Dutch attitude about conceptual thinking. It's about change. There's nothing to be afraid of. To live in the present moment, to keep your head above the water, and try to find clever solution to do so. Completely different from my adopted home country, Scotland. This is all about geology. This is all about bedrock. We're talking about the election about should Scotland be independent or not. It was nearly a 50% vote balance. And look, there's already a geological fault line. So all the yes voters should go north of that fault line. The south voters live south, and Scotland is the problems are being solved. But I like this idea about geology. This is one of my heroes, James Hutton. James Hutton was from the Enlightenment period, the 1780s. He wrote this fantastic book on the theory of the Earth, and he's the guy who discovered geological time. So he made this fantastic research that the world has no beginning and no end. It's a continuous process of slow transformation. And I think ultimately that's for me the essence of landscape architecture. Landscape is always in the process of transformation. All what we do ultimately as landscape architects is writing a chapter in a book. And these are some fantastical illustrations. I like this bubbling geology as a kind of turmoil, and then this very thin layer of civilization on top of that. And these are fantastic illustrations. I once used them for an exhibition I organized about James Hutton. Another of my statements is that these days, like it or not, we are the children of the Google Earth revolution. Right, and this is quite fundamental, because when I was educated, Dutch landscape architecture was completely different from the Germans, and they were different from the Danish and the French. The Danish landscape architects, they made an oval into an ellipse that took them 20 years, and that was revolution. The Germans are, I call them ecological Taliban. They are kind of about ecology. The French are just waffling away about philosophy and memory, and that's all gone. We are all now intermixed. My students also in Harvard, they come from everywhere. They're all reading the same books. They're all it's one big muddle, which is on one hand very exciting and sometimes also to be worried. So yes, we are the children of the Google Earth revolution. This is with this guy. I was only sitting around the table yesterday because he's my client. He's Mark Shuttleworth, and he's the first guy who spent 30 million to go into space as a space tourist. So with my idea about the Google Earth revolution, this is of course the ideal client. I'm designing right now a 60-hectare private estate for him. And of course, we borrow here from the Eames this idea of factor 10, this idea of zooming in, zooming out, this idea that we can really make a global garden out of somebody who's been in outer space. Of course, this is all not new. Other two paintings by Vermeer, the astronomer and the geographer, and I like this combination and those key disciplines in trying to understand the Earth and the territory we live in. And I think this kind of slightly more metaphysical way is kind of slightly underwhelmed in recent landscape architecture. I think some of the history of my profession has a profound ideas about how we sit in a kind of not only terrestrial but also celestial world. This is my own father. It's the first time I show my father in his display. He looks very young there. But what I remember about my father is he was always flying around the world, literally around the world in one go in the 1950s, and he wrote quite an interesting story about that. But I very much remember the globe on his desk showing that world. And this is even go further in history. This is 1580s, and this is family Hooftman, right? Hooftman. And this is Giles Hooftman, so a very, 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 very old, potentially lined up with my family. And what's interesting about Giles Hooftman was he had 80 boats from the harbor in Antwerp, sailing all over the world. He was really getting fed up in opening all the maps of different scales and different sizes and all kind of on rolls. So he's the first guy who commissioned the atlas. He discovered the concept of the atlas. And so he commissioned Ortelius to make the theater of the world and make this into a proper atlas. So I like this idea that my family maybe is related to that. And I like this idea about looking to territory and landscape, maybe even on a big scale. Now, this is a bit, maybe a slight side part of the story, but of course, this is Versailles. And a couple of years ago, we were asked to do an intervention in Versailles as part of a limited competition, which we lost, but we were asked to study the gardens and do a modern intervention in the old gardens. And this is, of course, a fantastic megalomaniac signature garden, which I've always been so happily inspired by, that the bedroom of the king is exactly right bang in the center of the central axis. That feels good, if you own power, Being in the middle of your own design and linking your garden through the bedroom to the wider world. Wow. It's like the ultimate wet dream scenario, kind of. And here we go, put Vitruvius. Imagine this, this is the core of the bedroom of the king, laying in his own garden. Wow. So I was inspired by that, and I thought, well, what is actually going on here? What is all the kind of deeper meaning of all this? So we did our own research, which nobody else have written about, and it's completely speculative and probably complete nonsense. But yes, I'm impressed by this idea of the Sun King and his reference to Apollo, the light. This is a fantastic mirror to catch the sunlight. He was given fantastic globes. These two globes, 3.6 diameter each, were meant to sit in the hole of the mirrors. It shows an incredible detailed display of the Earth and the celestial world on the day the king was born. And wow. And so we did a little research, and last year there was a little conference in Harvard about airplane landscape. So I thought, well, instead of making all former airports into parks, what we have done in Tempelhof, I show you later, it's much more interesting to take a garden and make that into an airport. So that's what we done. So we took off ourselves from the central basin, flying through the bedroom, and this is our little research. And this idea that the whole world is become a small place is maybe not a recent phenomenon. Because all we've done here is this is geometrically completely correct. We're following the line of the axis of Versailles. And where do we end up? Right. Food for thought, because we end up on the Temple Mount, Jerusalem. Now, could be interesting. I'm not saying it is. Because, this whole idea about Apollo, the idea of the garden, the sun goes up and down, linking that with the Christianity, which, of course, Louis XIV was still the representative of God on earth. It makes a really interesting reading and rereading of the gardens. Darwin, another one of my heroes, of course, with his ideas about evolution. Now, I just introduce him here because there is one moment that Darwin was very friendly to Hooker. Hooker was the curator of Kew Gardens, for which we did this master plan more recently. So we did research in all of that. And we found that there was a very interesting correspondence between Hooker and Darwin, and that Hooker actually already started to implement the latest ideas about evolution in the garden itself. The garden originally were organized by Hooker literally according to the evolution of plants, even before the book was finished. This was something we researched and discovered and was already forgotten by most people at Kew itself. But I'd like to show you that they have done once a landscape project together, Darwin and Hooker. It's not very well known. It's in the middle of nowhere. It's on the Ascension Islands. The Ascension Islands is literally in the middle between Africa and South America. Very important for the kind of for the empire, because it's a good foothold to sail around the world. There was one problem: there was no sweet water, and the mountain was completely barren before Darwin and Hooker came. So what Hooker and Darwin did, they literally planted the top of the mountain with trees. Now those trees came from everywhere. Part of the trees came from South America, part of them came from Africa. So forget about native planting. This was just mixing them all up. And the beauty was that it created a complete new ecosystem which collected the clouds in the tree canopies. Therefore, caused the clouds to drop their moisture into rain. They created a beautiful dew pond. And because of that, they had access to sweet water, and therefore good for the empire. And I like this very much because it really shows that nature is something you can construct. Forget about this idea about nature conservation, and it's all about nature activation. You can create nature, and you can create that by being clever and intelligent, and not being kind of dogmatic about native species, etc. Famous favorite painting. I only discovered this a couple of years ago. Martin Heath. Some of his fantastic paintings are around the corner here in the big brother of this museum. I like it very much because it shows, first of all, it shows foreground and background. I'm talking about zooming in, zooming out. This is both in one painting. The very detailed orchard on the foreground, the wider panorama on the background. It's also very exotic. It's also very sensual. The birds, the flower, and all those kind of things. So, and funny enough, although I discovered that painting 2 years ago, that this is an image we made more than 15 years ago. So it's a kind of inspiration in retrospect. And what I do now is show you very quickly some gross max imagery, and then more in detail some projects. And again, first, gross max, the work we conduct is all about visuality. It's about the central exploration of space as a journey to space and time. It's about trying to create more specific distinction in an otherwise world where everything becomes look-alike. A lot of the work we do is competitions. This is a competition we lost. In fact, we lost against Gustafsson, the speaker in spring. But we lost because we put Prince Charles this is the Princess Memorial Fountain, Hyde Park. We put Prince Charles as a little sulky boy in a pink shirt in the background. Wasn't appreciated. So the idea that landscape could be installation. This is a project with the very, I think, one of the most interesting contemporary artists, Mark Dayon. Great guy to collaborate with. This was a vertical garden we did in the center of London. A lot of the work we do is hard landscape, public space, in all kinds of shapes and formats. This is actually the proposition for an intervention in the garden of Versailles, a very romantic garden as an antidote to the Baroque. Park is, of course, the icing on the cake in the work we do. And it's not only about parks, but how parks are situated in the urban fabric. It's about the kind of cinematic experience of landscape. This is a glass house where lights are moving in the night and creating shadow projections of those orchids on the outer skin of the glass house, which gives a kind of movable feast. A lot of the work we do is collaboration with architects, and as part of that is a lot of work with Zaha Hadid. Here is a railway station outside Naples, in which we try to bring the Vesuvius volcano into the overall composition and the design of the arrival experience. Some of the work is more based on provocations, experiments, and exhibitions. And all this creeps upward to the bigger, more regional scale, the waterfront in Barcelona, propositions for the bay in Copenhagen, and the design of a new town in Qatar. I like this plan very much. It's not drawn by Gross Max, it's Sir Abercrombie. It's actually from 1944. It's how to rebuild London after the war. I like this idea of the graphics. It's the idea that London isn't this metropolitan beast, is a conglomeration of all those little neighborhoods who create their own identities as cells with their own nucleus. Very much like the real biology. And I like this kind of idea that we can look to cities as organisms. But we can look to cities as networks. This is a painting by one of the situationists, Constant. And this is some of the studies we done again with Zaha Hadid to create a more fluent breaking away from the Cartesian geometry to an altogether more different kind of urbanism. Now this project is by far the best project I'm going to show you. So you can escape to the back door. It's a project, we didn't do anything. So it's very ecological sound because we didn't waste any energy, right? We didn't make any drawings, we didn't have any client, nothing. It's just a found project. It's also very close by, it's just around the corner where I live. A lot of people think I'm an urban rat, that I live like in a gutter, you know, somewhere in London. It's not true, I live in the countryside, I'm not stupid. So the project is this, those are this beautiful line of cubes in this unrolling sand dune landscapes. And of course those cubes are part of the warfare. These were trying to keep the Germans out, trying to stop them invading Scotland, as if they didn't have aeroplanes, you know. It's like any war, you try to fight the previous war in terms of strategy. However, I like very much this line, this kind of land art line into the landscape. But see what happens. And again, I repeat, we didn't do anything. It's not my fault. We just recorded it and made it our own manifesto. It's what happens on top of this concrete blocks of warfare, which are actually quite beautiful in their own right, because they kind of put in situ in great haste during the war. So they got the seashells and the sand, and they got this kind of authenticity of that. But look what happens on top of that, and that's just pure nature, you know, sand blowing in the wind, birds dropping the little shit with seeds, and you got these little pedestals, this concrete blocks of warfare, creating pedestals for the spontaneous nature, very fragile nature. It's like a little present. Look at this, and if you look to some of the details, it's like a Japanese Zen garden or Chinese rock garden. It's fantastic. I showed this in Vienna, and they keep on asking me, but how did you do it? What's your management plan? And I told them, I said, you guys, you got Wittgenstein, you got Freud, you got the whole lot, and you still don't get it. Well, at least in Boston, they're a bit more intelligent than that. But look, I mean, that's also interesting, you know, how nature then start to crack up these concrete blocks of warfare. And of course, the other theory I have in life that everything is done before. So I don't know if you guys know the Jewish memorial in Berlin. Eisenman. Well, I should ask for copyrights because it's all done before in my back garden. Right, a couple of projects. This is a very example of a tiny installation. It's a glass house in which we try to make this kind of weird plant collection. And it's just a folly. It's no utility, then it's just non-utility. It's about the idea of a folly, the idea of the layering of light and textures in a sense of mystery. It's quite close to the house of an art lover of Charles René Mackintosh, so we call this the garden for a plant collector. So just the idea that some of those small projects we do, and in fact this was an art competition we won, they come back in bigger later projects, in more substantial projects, but it allows us to kind of experiment. This is another example as an installation we did in the city of Liverpool. And the client was a small art center which was called the Rotunda, so we were interested in the concept of the Rotunda. I've always liked the idea that Greek columns are actually representing the stem of plants. One of my favorite follies is Dessert de Rats, this little pavilion, and literally kind of brought this into Liverpool as a kind of community project. Again, just a very simple, low-budget, temporary intervention. And I had problems with the planting, I promise you. So we mixed real and fake plants. And I quite like that, why not? We cannot be moralistic all the time. A more serious project, a small neighborhood park, however, on a very strategic location in London, next to the Greater London Authority, designed by Norman Foster, next to Tower Bridge and opposite the Tower of London. And this is the idea of a landscape, of a kind of movement through a more intensified space, opening up towards the river, stepping down to the river where the landscape becomes like a belvedere overlooking to the panoramic skyline of the City of London beyond. And it's a kind of combination of neighborhood park, a park for tourists, a park for the people who walk in this area. Probably the achievement is not so much the park as design, but the fact that we actually convinced the authorities to give away the land into a trust. Because we have a trust, we literally can appoint a head gardener, and the money which is generated in the park is being reutilized in the park itself. And that allows us to, in this case, we introduced Piet Oudolf. That was before actually he did the High Line. We probably were the first landscape architects who invited him to do a project in the public realm, out with the realm of the private garden. It's very simple events, fields, stepping down to the river. The idea that you don't need seats, but it's kind of relaxed way of creating the landscape so it becomes theatrical. There are some elements designed. This is Pottersfield Park with fields of the potters. We literally found evidence of the archaeology of the pottery produced on this field in the 17th century, and we copied those in terms of color and patterns in the details of the design. The construction of the neighborhood garden. This is the intense garden with Piet Oudolf, and this is of course the idea of celebrating this kind of wonderful world of plants, which we kind of forgotten. Also in London, you know, Hyde Park, Regent's Park, all those big parks, there's only grass, grass, grass. And then you got the one odd Chelsea flower show for 2 weeks a year. So here the idea is that we really should try to intensify nature in a very condensed way as an experience in the urban realm. And of course, we all know Piet's planting in a way that it's not only for one season. It's very clever that the decay and the transformation of the vegetation in the season still create a strong character throughout the year. And this is I think the grass in this park is the most dug up piece of grass in entire London. So every time something happens on this field, because it's such a strategic location opposite the Tower Bridge, from dead parrots to kind of fake Stonehenge still, even camel races. This is a square we did in Birmingham. This project was all about the city of Birmingham was kind of in the 1960s became one spaghetti junction of motorways. Again, thanks to the German who bombed it in the first place, of course. The IRA later did also a bit of bombing. Now it's time to reinstate the urban fabric of streets and plazas into a complete pedestrian network. So this project is all about, in fact, to negotiate, because when you look at this image of the Gothic church and nearly sublime building by future systems, and then a very mediocre shopping building. So as a landscape architect, you have to be quite, I think, being intermediate and rather restrained, dare I say. I think that our soft landscapes tend to be more exuberant and the more urban landscape tends to be more minimal. What we try to do here, for example, is to make a connection with this moving sculpture is not only very strategically located, but it's the same height as the spire of the church below. So you're starting to see this kind of visual networks as part of this kind of urban fabric. And the idea is that a good urban space is a space where you slow down, you linger, you spend time, and without writing amphitheater all on top of this, it's of course a very theatrical space where you can start to observe people, and you know, people like to watch people, and people like to be seen, and that kind of theatrical play is for us very important in the public realm. And the kind of water sculpture we designed to kind of draw people into the space. Another more recent project is, and this was quite an interesting project because this in fact it was an art commission, and it was a collaboration again with Piet Oudolf. We were invited to be part of the Amsterdam Kunst festival. But what was interesting that we had an open brief, so we could select our own site. Now this is fascinating. I don't think as a landscape architect you are often in a position to fund your project. Normally this is the project, this is the brief, this is the budget, off you go. So in this fantastic former industrial landscape, we were like, you know, in a sweet shop of possibilities. And we selected an old waterworks site with it's actually a monument because of it's one of the oldest of this type of waterworks. But we liked it very much because we saw the potential of not just to do a temporary intervention, but to transform this into a permanent park, which was much more interesting for Pete and us to than a kind of throwaway gesture. And the other thing what I really liked is about it's two strong circles. I mean, and Pete, by all accounts, I can say because he's not here tonight, but Pete's work sometimes is a bit fluffy, you know, it's just fluffs on. And it needs a bit of architecture there, I say. So the idea of Pete's work in a very strong shape, I think it works very well. And if you look to the Renaissance gardens, you often see this symbol of two circles. Again, often it's about the terrestrial world and the celestial world. But it's a motif you see in all kind of Renaissance type of architecture. So we wanted to create a garden. One is a sunken garden, which you kind of descend into, and one is a water garden. The water garden is, of course, all about reflection. So it's actually about the sky, and it is about the earth. And some of the early drawings about this. And then working with some of the existing structures of the old waterworks as a way of seeing the gardens in different ways. And of course, the kind of inspiration of the more classical garden typologies. A section to the sunken garden, the way how you descend in this kind of theater of plants, and the water garden. And it's a way of intriguing way of kind of circling down and finding your way into this space. It's also, the Brits makes it very nice also to see other people making this move. So again, it's quite theatrical in its overall approach. And a collaboration with a light artist to make this piece, which is kind of moving around the garden. Right, we talked about light and landscape, and maybe Joseph Beuys wasn't all that right. This is, I got still a house in the Netherlands, a small wooden old fisherman hut on a former island, and this is the road to my little hut on the island. And just to show you the beautiful, still beautiful display of light in this kind of Dutch landscape. And we wanted to bring that in one of our projects, and this project is to make a garden on a kind of leftover piece of land which belongs to a cultural history museum in the Netherlands called the Zuiderzee Museum. The brief was very nice and very short, the shortest brief I ever had, one sentence. Please create us the most beautiful garden in Europe. Point, I like that. And this is all kind of interventions working with the different coastlines. And it's very kind of, dare I say, a very romantic approach in terms of the planting. Again, as you already understood, I like flying. I like to be above, but I also like to descend. Because the project was for a museum, the project became a very big display in a museum. We had about 6 of this type of animations in kind of floating into the exhibition space of the project. It's quite nice to design underwater gardens as well. And some of the models of this landscape. What we try to do here is these are basins of water, and each of the basins got a different depth, and it got a different soils, from very dark peat to white seashells. So the idea is that those basins of water facing this big expanse of water is a kind of display of different watercolors, different reflections of water, of light on water will create this kind of different tones of blue. And that little animation we played at the beginning tonight was based on this project. Since we work so much with Zaha, I had to show something of this. And with Zaha, it's a really love-hate relationship. For example, he doesn't like trees. She's not a tree hugger at all, which makes life very difficult with us and her sometimes. Because every time we draw a tree, she kind of photoshops it out. However, this is the Transport Museum in Glasgow, and it's a fantastic structure. In fact, it's one building which looks better from the sky than from the ground. It's also typically Zaha, because it's just a big Z, it's a big signature building, as you do as an iconic architect. However, it's on the confluence of the River Clyde and the River Calvin, so obviously the dynamics of the building expresses the kind of confluence of the two rivers. But for us, it's a kind of quite a minimal job of trying to blend in the landscape and the uses around the building in conjunction with that big shed. That's quite good. That's quite cool. That's exactly what we need, a bit of music. That's Isabella Gardner. She mixed it all up, music, landscape, architecture. We're still too tame here. Another building, this is actually won the Sterling Prize, as mentioned, with Zaha. And this is actually quite nice, because this is in a very complicated part of London, a lot of deprivation. And this is one of the new academy schools. And it's actually quite nice to see Zaha designing a school instead of a museum or another palace or whatever. And this school actually had a very cramped site, although they put sports as one of the main aspects on the curriculum. So one of the things we designed here is this kind of running track which just shoots through the building. And it works very well. This is the only school in the entire world where the children actually run into the classrooms. And out again as well, of course. But anyway, this is just an example of some of those type of collaborations we do with architects. This is a small intervention in China. And this was one of those broken English emails you get once in a while. And they ask us to be part of a festival in China to do an installation. And they called it the 9 Masters of the World, which was nice. It was Martha Swartz, it was West 8, all the real masters. And then they couldn't find anybody in Great Britain, so we became also master. And it is in Xi'an. And what do I know about China? Google Earth, just Google. But of course, it's where the terracotta warriors was. So before I started the project, I thought, well, it has to be terracotta. So if they got all those warriors buried in the ground, there must be terracotta. And I was only for 2 days in China for this project. And the first day was all this official events and speaking, and dinners, and in the middle of nowhere, and I didn't really felt at all in China or whatever. So the next day, I literally escaped. I took a taxi into the mountains, but somebody told me that there's this 1,000-year-old pottery village in the mountains. So I tried to find it. I did find it, and really had a fantastic time to see this really crafts, untouristy way of doing crafts in potters. A fantastic settlement. And I also visited in the afternoon a terracotta factory where they make roof tiles. So I'd done everything within 24 hours to do the project. And this is the project. The project is actually a shrine, a kind of folly for one of the famous the British plant hunters, Wilson. Wilson actually not only collected plants for Kew Gardens, but also very much for the Arnold Arboretum here in Boston. So he collected over 5,000 different plants from China, like a hyperactive squirrel. And so we wanted to make this shrine for the plant collector with a kind of strange display of his plants. And the structure is built out of stacked pan tiles. That's all it is. So it's just stacked pan tiles, making this shrine and this world of plant collecting plants. And of course, it needs to grow a bit. For this, it was very just after the opening, so it needs to grow, and it started to grow a bit more. And here we go. Right, more China. All roads lead to China, right? Students here in the room, you will end up in China. If you are from China, you will return to China. Everything happens in China. I often show this flight to China, and I'm a real booker, so I ask the Chinese audience, where is this in China? And it's thinking and thinking again. And I had a very clever student, when I was giving a lecture in Beijing, and the student said, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hey, it's one too many. Very clever, Pagoda's always got 9 stories, not 10. This is, of course, Kew Garden, William Chambers, who wrote a fantastic manifesto about Chinese landscape as a new influence for the British landscape design. He was there as a young boy early in his career. And I found it very fascinating that actually a hell of a lot of the English garden design is influenced by Chinese garden design. So all what we do now is we borrowed it all from China, right? Took it to Britain, built it into our gardens, and now we're shipping it all back again with great profits. So it's an interesting global trade of landscape. This is the project we're working on right now. It's a central park in the central business district in Beijing. It's a long linear park. We're creating these strange artificial mountain ranges. They are slices of metal, quite big pieces, all put in conjunction to create this 500-meter long artificial mountain range. Below this is a sunken shopping mall. All of this is actually a deck on the ground shopping. A big strip of Chinese woodland, a stream, and a moon reflecting pool. With the idea you cannot make a Chinese landscape without mountain, forest, and rivers. Beijing is, of course, a fantastic city, pure grid, north-south, forbidden palace, sitting in the center. Again, the relationship between the celestial world of the empire and the terrestrial world of the land itself, with the king, a bit like, Louis XIV, which I talked about in that strategic position. And of course, Feng Shui, the mountains as a horse shape around Beijing, creating the ideal conditions to the south, opening up to the plain. So we like that kind of geographic position, and we like the idea that the kind of new skyline of Beijing, and those towers are 600 meters high, or the highest, and that's exactly the same height as the first ring of hills of that kind of crescent around Beijing. So we found this kind of interesting analogy between the artificial skyline and the natural skyline. If you are in the 1,600-meter towers and the air is not too polluted, which I dare say is very seldom, you will see this kind of ring of mountains in the skyline. So we like this interplay, and therefore we kind of make a kind of miniature inspiration of the mountains, the forest, and the rivers into this kind of more man-made park. the whole idea of the mountain range is that from all different angles it would give different perspective. If you ride along the park 60 miles an hour, you see this kind of strange flickering. If you walk below or next to it, if you see it from above, we believe or we hope that from each angle you get a different kind of optical experience of this mountain. It's on the moment it's under construction. It's not an easy project, as you can imagine. We did a lot of work on how to draw a mountain. Of course, the park is meant to become part, as a segment, to become part of a ring of an inner green structure. The idea of the forest to bring down the scale of the park is not meant, it's really meant to be a forest. Literally the trees would be lifted. They are real trees, they're not from nurseries, they're kind of trees from the forest. And this moon reflecting pool, the whole idea, or the original idea, we had to change it a bit, was that it could be used in an ice ring in the winter, but also it's got we call it the moon reflecting pool. So there's a projection of light onto the pool, which if it's kind of a crescent shape moon, it's literally reflected in the pool. If it's full moon, you see the full moon. So it changes with the days and the time of the months. It's quite interesting working in China is that the Chinese clients and people you talk to, they like to know the story. They like to know the narrative. You know, in Britain they all think that I'm a clown. I'm an, you know, kind of, oh, here he goes again with his stories. But in China they really are very keen to understand a kind of narrative behind a project. The woodlands, the seasons, and the model of the mountain range. Right, the very last project, it's a kind of the project we won 2 years ago to redesign the former Tempelhof Airport in Berlin into a new public park of the 21st century. And of course, here we go again, my love for flying, both in terms as play as the heroic. And of course, this very loaded site. You know, this site is loaded with layers of German history, both good and bad. The site is this. You know, this is Tempelhof Airport. It's an incredible big void in the city. It's considerably larger than the Tiergarten, which is the biggest park, the woodland. And because that's a big woodland park, we always thought that the Tempelhof should be one big meadow park, because it's a typology of a meadow, not of a forest. Don't worry, I only showed this once in Germany. But I just wanted to make the point about politics and town planning. It's called Tempelhof Airport. It was the field of the Templars. So originally the Knight Templars were going on crusade to, dare I say, Temple Mount. Everything connects here. They had their base camp on this Tempelhof site. The site has always been open because it's very exposed. It's to do with its glacial origin, its poor soil. So it always has been a field, an open field, and then subsequently used for military parades. Then it became the first civil airport in Europe in the early 1920s, where the idea of flight was about theater. So that former airport is now only, you find traces as a palimpsest on site. It's being replaced by this more Hitler-induced airport. And then it suddenly became heroic in the Cold War, when Berlin was being cut off and only to be accessed by the air, by the Luftbrücke, the air bridge. And they all landed on Tempelhof Airport. So there's incredible layers of heroic and difficult to talk about histories as well. This is a painting by Kiefner about one of those hangars as part of the building. This building is Norman Foster called it the mother of all airports. It's a fantastic building. It's 1.6 kilometers long. It's one of the longest building facades in the entire world, and that really holds the space fantastically. And you know, it kind of embraces this big void. And we like this void because, you know, if it rains, it really rains, and you can have sun and rain at the same time. It's fantastic. And one of our inspiration was the beautiful film by Wim Wenders. It's called Himmel über Berlin. So in German, it's kind of slightly translated Wings of Desire in English. But it's about angels, and I don't know if you had time to read the Edgar Allan Poe quote, but he talks about angels hovering about the landscape and seeing it in a different perspective. And this is our concept, and I repeat, my profession is very simple, keep it simple. It's the idea of celebrating and demarcating the void by this kind of activity on the outside, this overlooping diagram of movement. To frame. This was a stage competition, and when we started the project it was very abstract, and it became more towards this final, doing the different rounds of this competition. So this still the idea of the encircling the circuit, intertwining circuit, new north-south, keeping the runways, and kind of engraving this huge 1.6 kilometers building as a kind of landform into the landscape with a slightly more intensification of this kind of circuit, this kind of orbit towards the airport building. And for us it was very important to look to the park in this wider context. So the park is a city park. It's about cold air movement. It's about movement of ecology and a movement of people to the city as a kind of green network. So we like this idea of the control tower, being in the control tower, looking to this kind of park in its wider context. He's not drinking his coffee, he's completely obsessed. And so a lot of the ideas about this was actually you don't have to do too much in the center, but it's all about the connectivity and making this part. Obviously it was, you know, as an airport kind of isolated like an archipelago on its own, and now trying to weave it back into its urban fabric. Everything is done before. I said it. This is Bath, but this idea is very interesting because this building is a fascist building, right? It's very intriguing. Out of all the over 100 competition entries, nobody made a statement about the building. Nobody dared to touch it. When I presented this for the big jury, they did ask me, "How do you dare to, you know, to work with a fascist building? You know, how do you go to sell that?" And we said, "Well, bugger off. You know, it will be a temple of the arts. It would all be about a new Germany. It's you know, it's a new chapter." So this is the idea of the land is very flat, which I like because I come from Holland. Now every little elevation gives me, you know, fear of heights. But this is slightly tilting, so it's flat, but it tilts a bit. So that means that here the landform is level on zero. Because the land tilts away, we can keep the landform on one datum, and then it flows into the building. So it's kind of, the landform is actually quite subtly kind of interwoven into the layer of the land. And then this idea about pioneer uses, so the idea that on the edge of the park, pioneer users could occupy, and literally people could apply for the park to use land if they have a good idea, and over time it can transform into a more permanent proposition. Now this, in a funny way, it has been the Trojan horse of the project, right? Because something happened only very recently, is that the people who were occupying the land were thinking, this is nice. And they caused a referendum in the city of Berlin with the idea that they didn't want to have any future housing on the edge of the park. They won the referendum, and that means if there's no urban edge, there's no money for my park. So it's being put on hold. Which is kind of sweet as well, or not? Because it's like, it's like a Trojan horse. You know, you invite people to become part of it, and then they take over. It's quite clever. But this was the original idea. The idea was that there's a kind of transformation over time, which is what I literally call the pioneer uses, and over time becomes pioneer urbanization. And the nature, we would activate the nature, we would not conserve it. And again, tell the Germans, you know, we not believe in conservation, we want activation. So that we're going to activate the meadows, and it will transform over time. So this scenario idea was much more important than the actual master plan I showed you before. It's a kind of idea of a process. It's very interesting. Nature is also adapting very well to a site like this, and all the spontaneous nature and the different habitats are fantastic ways. Again, I had to write this out of the script, but this was the idea that I would do the planting myself. With little seed bombs. And again, I'm very lazy, so I didn't make any planting plans. I just referred to Jackson Pollock painting. And the idea, this is of course Dürer, this is the idea of nature activation. So you got a piece of meadow as beautifully drawn by Albrecht Dürer in 1500, and see how we can activate that. And nature is a fantastic thing, because when it was this fascistic building, they had this big eagle on top of the building. And of course, there were no birds on the whole thing, because birds, you know, they were shit scared. And now they took the eagle away, and we got all this nature moving in. It's fascinating. The other thing is that people are allowed on certain areas to have barbecues, right? So you have all those Germans doing their barbecues. And they are a meat-loving, eating country. And what is interesting is that rare birds of prey, who are really rare, they are now hovering around the airport, just waiting for the leftovers. It's fascinating. Nature is really not static. Nature is dynamic. Nature is clever as well, intelligent. You know, we're often too patronizing about nature. You know, try to cuddle it. And, you know, nature can take care after itself. With a bit of conflict, that's why we need Darwin theories. Right, of course we did pieces of architecture with our friends Sutherland Hussey architects for the different pieces. These are beehives inspired by the paraphernalia of the airport, reconfiguration of structures, simple devices to do birds watching, the shape of the land, the very beauty of the run. This park is fantastically used already. It's being used for all those hedonistic sports with all those big kites with people floating in the sky. It's quite exciting. Intensifying the meadows. This north-south connection is orientated right exactly to the existing Alexanderplatz tower, so it's kind of aligned with that. So again, a trick to make the park part of the wider urban fabric. One odd one out of all those elements is this kind of hill, 60 meters high rock monument. And only this little thing, and the park is so big, 360 hectares, and there's only this little 60 meters high rock. And then in the press, it was all about the rock. You know, mad Dutchman wants to build mountain in Berlin. And it's quite interesting. I presented this not that long ago in Paris as a conference about Le Notre, and I was asked to talk about the influence of Le Notre on the work of Gross-Max. Here you go. So I showed them that video, by the way, and they were all kind of, because they just published a book, it's in the bookshop here. This Le Notre is a big exhibition, and they forgot to mention my sideline. Anyway, this rock is. But those French students, they're bloody arrogant. Harvard students are nice, they're polite, you know. But French students are very arrogant, kind of like that. But and they said, "Okay, we like the project, but we don't understand the rock. You know, the rock looks, you know, over the top. Is one step too far." And Gustafsson, who was in the audience, the speaker after me, she stood up and she defended the rocks. She said, "No, Eelco, and Bridget, they were right, because putting the rock asymmetric in the site gives dimension to the site. It gives a kind of not only a point of reference, it makes the sites dynamic, and kind of seeks further to defend my rock." So I will thank her and for gift as he won the Princess Diana fountain. So on the edge of the park is more this pioneer woodlands, the kind of transformation over time of the different uses, circulating that void. Temporary ideas of the the field of tarmac in front of the airport. New restaurant, centrally positioned to kind of celebrate the view. The idea of a big mirror pond, which again can be used as a skating rink, inspired by those Flemish masters. The rock. Now there's a funny story about the rock, because, okay, what is it? Well, the whole idea is that it was inspired by von Humboldt, the plant geographer, who went to South America, and he kind of made the first theories about altitudes and plants, and in fact, plant geography is his discovery. So, we got Darwin in Britain, so give it to Germans, they got von Humboldt, and let's make him a monument. And, the whole Germany is full of monuments about war, and this would be a monument about nature. And the idea is that it would be the biggest climbing school of Europe on the inside. And we did economic research that it would be verifiable, and it would be a shaft of light, and this weird, beautiful, hedonistic people climbing on those rocks. And then something interesting happened, because my 11-year-old daughter and I were playing on the beach. And then my daughter said, "Papa, look, has he found this rock?" Right? It's about this height. It's completely flat on the bottom. And wow, it's like the Matterhorn. It's pretty cool. It's much better than this, which looks quite lumpy and a bit phallic, So all what we've done is that we scanned the rock, 3D. So we got all the AutoCAD drawings, we got all the sections. It only took us an hour. And now we could, if they only allow us, build the rock. So there we go. Again, the idea of the wide, expansive panorama, the water. The water is not just ornamental, it's a big recycling of all the water. There's 28 hectares of hard surface in front of this airport building, 28 hectares. So the water would be kind of recycled and reutilized in the overall scheme. And this is what caused the controversy. This is not us, but the overall master plan is we would design the park, and then over time there would be an urbanization of the edge of the park. And that's what the people of Berlin started to oppose against. And this is just, again, I did this by not that long ago. I've never done it consciously before, but this, to come full circle in my story tonight, is that the painting, Rembrandt, my hometown, the idea of the horizon, water, land, horizon, it all comes back. Right, thank you very much for the incredible patience tonight.